Hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. And for those new to Teams Day Online 2021, welcome to the conference. And for those that have already started on the session, welcome to the second session in the security track today. Just to let you know, these sessions are being recorded and you will be on mute during the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. And also at the end of the session, there will be time for a Q&A. So my name is Nikki Chapple. I'm an enterprise architect and organisational change manager working for Entity Limited. I'm the moderator for today's security track, but I'm also doing the presentation now. So just let these few people in. So my presentation today is all about collaborating securely with guests in Teams. So today we're going to got about 40 minutes to have a very brief overview, and it will be a brief but a deep dive overview in all about managing guest access and managing it securely. Because one of the things that I find, and I work with clients a lot deploying Teams for large multinational companies, is that thought of allowing external people into your Microsoft 365 environment can be quite scary. But one of the things is, for the majority of organization, you need to collaborate with people externally, whether it's partners or suppliers, customers, etc. And if you don't allow them to use a safe and secure environment such as Teams, where you control the data, you can control the configuration, you manage the data, you can control everything. If you don't do that, the likelihood is they'll go out and use something else. And that technology might not even be in control of IT. So hence you get that shadow IT technology. Your data potentially is lost, it's uncontrollable. So it's much better to invite people in and securely manage their access and what they can control, because you can always revoke and remove their access. So we'll go through some best practices for collaboration, and we'll go through the lifecycle management process, and we'll just kind of review. So one of the important things to think about when you're talking about guests is it's not a feature necessarily within Teams. So everything we're really going to be looking at now is going to be in your Active Directory area. So when you create a guest, what you're actually doing is you're creating a business-to-business account within your Active Directory environment. Now, this is important to know because a lot of clients that I'm working with, maybe they haven't moved their Exchange Online into Microsoft 365. So they're still in this hybrid world where you're managing your users in an Azure environment, and then you're synchronizing your users into Microsoft 365. You need to think, when you start adding guests in, they are being managed directly within the cloud. That means they have no access at all to any of your information internally within your kind of on-premise world, because you're just giving them an account to the cloud and a subset of that. So other things to note here is that it's an invitation process that you manage within Teams. So it's down to a nominated group of users to invite people into Teams. And when they get invited into Teams, you will get this guest account created. The authorization process and policies are actually going to be managed by the end user, their existing account, but you then put those protections and controls around it. So this is how the process will work. So you would send an invitation via Teams to the user who's outside of your organization. And basically that user is going to sign in with their existing identity provider. You're not setting up a kind of a new account where you've got to manage a username and password independently. They're going to use their own credentials. Now, that could be several different ways. So if they're already got an Azure Active Directory account, so this is a lot of organizations that are already using Microsoft 365, they would sign in with Active Directory. Or if you've got direct federations such as SAML or WS Fed, it can use those credentials. Now, there's some newer ones that are coming in as well. So Google Federation, Microsoft personal accounts like Outlook.com and Hotmail. So those will actually federate directly. Now, there's some new functionality coming out as well called one-time password. And this passcode will come in by default in October. And what that means is anybody else that doesn't have any of those 4 options above will be able to sign it in, and they will be emailed a code to actually get into your environment. That means those users don't have to set up a Microsoft account to specifically get in. So that's just sort of the process that it works. They're going to authorize with their own identity, and then you're going to put the controls around what guests can do and what guests can see. So what happens is when you create the guest account initially by somebody sending out an invitation, an account is immediately created within Azure AD, this guest account. So it's got a guest user type of guest, and it'll have a source called invited user. So that means an invitation has been sent out, that account has been created, but it hasn't been redeemed. So once the account is redeemed and somebody signs into Teams, the status is updated and the source will be updated to say how they joined. So in this case, it was an external Azure Active Directory, or it could be Google, or it could be a Microsoft. So you can see their source there. So you can actually see and manage your guest users within the Azure AD. So one thing that's important to note is with guests, the licensing model has slightly changed. It used to be a rule for every one user that you had a license for in Microsoft 365, you could invite 5 guest users. Well, that's recently changed. So basically the model now is the first 50,000 monthly active users in guests. That means a guest coming in and signing or interacting in with Teams, something like that, are free. After that, you will need to pay. So again, this is not how many physical guest accounts that you have in your Active Directory, but how many are being active. So that's the new rules now. So for the majority of the organization, you're not likely to have more than 50,000 guests that are actually involved in your tenant at any one time. So that's just a kind of a little kind of overview of how guests are managed. So it's all in that Azure AD. And then Azure AD is where you put all your protections and controls. So now, because we know that the guests have this identity and have a user type of guest, we can put some rules and controls around them. So the first thing you can think about with guests is this overall tenant view with external collaboration. So you've got a number of questions you need to ask yourself. Number one is who can invite guests? So by default, all users within your organization can invite guests. That means if you've got teams, any member within that team can invite a guest into the organization. You can limit that down to people that are just in a specific security group, or you can limit it down further and just say, I just only want the administrator accounts to do it. The warnings with those is if you limit that productivity by end users, you need to have a process in place whereby if somebody asks for an external person to be added as a guest, that it's managed in a timely manner. Now, for a small organization, that might be suitable, but when you come for large organizations, you might be getting hundreds of requests in. Have you got the resources, potentially saying your IT team, to support that? So really the recommendation is maybe when you start out and you're kind of trialing it while people are getting their feet, you maybe want to restrict it. But really what you want to do at the end of the day is empower people, make sure users are trained to know what they're doing when they're inviting guests. You can also control what guests can be invited. So by default, you can invite anyone But you do have this ability to have either a kind of like a whitelist or a deny list. So you can put in domains that you will allow people to be invited for, or you can block domains. So you do have that capability as well. And again, that's done at the tenant level. The third item here that you can set up is what organisational information will guests be permitted to see. There's 3 levels. By default, they get the medium level. So that means a guest will see the user attributes for the members within their teams. They will be able to see if you've got the organisational hierarchy on for those members within the team, who reports them and who they report to, maybe some other groups that they're in. So potentially from that, they could then start going through and seeing some other user information within your environment if they know people's email addresses. There is a new feature that's just come out now where you can actually limit the guest access down. So they cannot see any of that organizational data. So you can't go in and see their roles, who they're working for, etc. So that's quite a useful feature to switch on there. So they're the kind of the areas that we want to kind of look at there, really from a tenant level, and that's managed within Azure AD under a section called External Identities. So that's your tenant level. Then the next thing we really recommend people do when you invite guests into your tenant is to think about a terms of use. So with your users internally, you would normally have to sign some acceptable use processes, other policies, etc., as part of your joiners, movers, leavers process. You're not going to have anything like that with guests. Well, you can define a set of rules that people need to sign up to before they access Teams or Microsoft 365, or potentially any of the SaaS products that you're managing within sort of that Microsoft stack. So how it works is a guest is invited for team as per normal. The guest receives the email to say you're joining a team. Then what happens is the guest tries to access the team. So they click on the link. So rather than going straight into the team as a guest, they're going to be presented with this terms of use. That terms of use is something you create and upload as a PDF file. And the user has a number of options. So if they don't do anything, then the next time they try and get into Teams, they're going to be presented with that terms of use again. If they decide to decline it, then they are going to be blocked from accessing Teams. So they won't be able to get in at all. The only way they'll get in is if they proactively accept that terms of use. And at that point, then it's logged, they are given access and they can enter into the team. The other thing that you can do here is you can set a kind of a review process. So you may want people to review and re-accept those terms of use, say, on a yearly basis. So say you can scope that, and this is done within the Azure AD. There's something called terms of use. So you can configure your terms of use there. You upload it as a PDF. You can have it in multiple languages if you like. You can have people expand it, so you don't just click it without reading it. You can have it so people open it. You can have things like consent on all devices. So if somebody comes in from their computer, they have to approve it. But then if they try to come in from a mobile phone, they would need to accept it as well. And there's this re-acceptance period as well. So you can have that. So that's all configured within the terms of use functionality. Then once you've got that up and running, you now need to link this into a conditional access policy. And what that conditional access policy will do, it will target that just at guests, because you don't want this policy in terms of use to be shown to your internal users. You just want it for your guest users. So you scope it just for your guests. Then the next step is you need to decide what applications you are going to target this for. So when do you want that terms of use to come out? Now, you can have it just for Teams. We really recommend that you include SharePoint and Outlook groups as well. The reasons for this is if you've got this process where someone has to come in and re-accept every year, it could be on that yearly basis they're opening up a Word document that was part of a team and they've gone directly into SharePoint. You can also expand it and have kind of Office 365. So if guests are going in and they might be using Planner or Forms, etc., within a team as well, they would get access and presented with the terms. And then lastly, you need to make sure you grant access and tick the box to say what particular terms of use. You can have multiple terms of use. So you could have one for Teams, you could have another one if you're using some other type of SaaS apps, etc., and you're going through here, you can put policies on those. So that's your terms of use. And the good thing about this is that you can monitor it. So you always get those things in IT, get those internal audits, and they want to make sure that you are in control of who's got access to your systems. You've now got evidence that somebody has signed up to a particular set of terms of use, and only those people are allowed in. So you've got that there ready to go. The other thing we look at is multi-factor authentication. So this is important, particularly with guests, because you are not in control of the devices and software that those guests are using. And multi-factor authentication prevents 99.9% of the attacks. You can use it even if, for internal staff, you're using a third-party product rather than the Microsoft multi-factor authentication. So we manage this process again in Azure AD. You can configure how you want multi-factor to be used. The recommendation is to use the Microsoft Authenticator app, but you can have text messages as well. So you can have some options there, and you can also set the option for how long you want the MFA to be remembered on a user's device. So you can limit that down to 1 day to make sure users always use MFA when they come in. So once you've configured that at the sort of tenant level, you can then use conditional access to actually enforce this. Again, you're looking at a policy here, particularly for guests. You can target the application. So for this time, for this particular one, I've decided to target it at all of the Office 365 applications. And then I want to allow access, and I'm saying access is going to be required with multi-factor authentication. Now, what you can do, if you wanted, you could merge this one in with the terms of use as well. So you could have 2 boxes ticked, and then for multiple controls, for this one, you would require all of those controls to be met. So you want the terms of use and the MFA. Another thing that you can look at is put protection around sign-in frequency. Again, because you haven't got so much control over those end user devices, you don't really want the kind of remember me functionality being enabled, because people might not necessarily have protection on their phones or their computers. So you can set another conditional policy for that. Again, we're focusing just on guests. Here, I've selected a different group of applications. You can say, I want to protect all cloud applications that's within the control. So here, so these are just examples of where I can say you can choose different settings. And then lastly, here, you've got this option, sign-in frequency. So I want to set it for 1 day. So that means people are going to be forced to sign in every day. And because we've set that MFA frequency for 1 day, every day someone signs in, they're going to sign in with their credentials and the MFA. So just putting that extra wrapper around. Now, when you're doing these conditional policies, it's really important that if you're already using conditional access policies inside your organization, to review them, because you can have some conflicts. So, for example, if you've already got a conditional access policy that says you can only join Teams from a compliant device or a hybrid joined device, etc., then that's going to immediately block your guests. So what you would need to do with these types of policies is put an exception in, say all people except guests, and then have a different policy. So the ones that you're going to be need to look at is things like device needs to be compliant, hybrid Azure AD joined, app protection policies, because a mobile phone device can only be managed by one organization. If you're controlling down by location, so I only want you to access Teams in these particular locations, again, guests not likely to be there. Other two, if you've got the higher levels, the kind of EMS packs, you might be using the sign-in risk and the user risks. Again, make sure you take guests out of those as well, because again, you can't manage those. The guest may not have been pre-signed for MFA and a guest doesn't have a password. So really make sure you review all of those with your conditional policies. Another thing you can look at is a privacy statement. So this is something that you might not have thought about, but what happens is when a guest is signing up to your team, they are presented with this privacy statement where they need to review the permissions about what information they are going to be sharing with your tenant and what's going to happen with it. If you don't have a privacy statement set up, it will show a message, as I've got on that screen, that it says on this one, Nikki's test tenant has not provided a link to their privacy statement for you to review. Whereas if you actually set that up in your Azure AD properties, a link to a public web page, then it would put that hyperlink in there. So sometimes these are just small things, but just recommended. Then when we start looking now at within Teams, so we've looked at some of those protections you can do within Azure AD about that access and control, and put some additional wrappers around and protection around it. So now what can we do in Teams to limit what guests can do? Well, by default, guests have a more limited view and functionality within Teams. But there are some options that you can configure in the Teams Admin Center to do with callings, meetings, and messaging, where you can decide and you can toggle on and off what you want guests to do. So you can further limit those down. So, for example, you might not want guests to do voice over IP calls within your tenant. You might want to block them screen sharing. You might not want them to have Meet Now. So that's done, I say, within the Teams Admin Center. Then when you go down to your individual teams themselves, the team owner has got the ability to do some configuration with their team. So within the team settings. So what they can do there is they can further limit if they want and decide what they want guests to do. So basically you can stop guests creating channels and deleting channels. So they can go in and configure that as well. But that is done on a kind of a team by team basis. So next we can look at restricting guests down to a particular team or a particular subset of teams. So by default, when you switch Teams on, it's on for the whole organization. So basically that means that anybody, any owner in a team can add in guests to their team. So what you can do is by putting sensitivity labels in, and I won't go into this in detail because there's another session on that, but you can put some levels of control on there. So on a team by team basis, when you're creating a team, what you'll have is you'll have an extra box, and part of that will enable you to have teams enable you to have guests, or it will block guests. So for example, the recommendation is to have at least 2 internal team, external team. So with an internal team, you would block guests coming into that team, and an external facing team, you would allow guests to coming in. So in that scenario, if someone was to try and invite a guest to a team that was internal only, when they type in their external email address, they would be blocked from doing that. So say there's a session on that later on today on this track. So we've got through and we've looked at some of the settings in the team. So how do we now go and look at removing guests from teams? Well, there's a feature called Azure Active Directory Access Reviews that we can use for that. So how that process works is that you create these reviews and you can review just guests, or you can review all users in groups. So what the process works by, a reviewer will review an email and they will be asked to review a list, in this case guests, in their teams, and they will need to make a decision on those guests. And you can have a justification in there for people to keep somebody in a team as well. And your options are that reviewer can actually deny access. So in that scenario, the response would be logged to say it's being denied, and the guest user would be removed from the team. The second option is they can approve access, potentially with an optional justification. The user would retain access until the next review point and continue as is. There's also additional options here, so you can put in some rules around what happens if the reviewer doesn't respond, and you can also have recommendations as well. So you can look to see if that person has access within the last 30 days, just to see if they're in there the 30 days, then the recommendation is keep them in the team. If they haven't accessed in 30 days, the recommendation would be to remove them. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a little look, a deeper dive now into the different types of access reviews and how that all works. Because this is really part of this kind of life cycle management. So we've looked at, you can configure it all, and most of those configurations are done in Azure Active Directory, but how does that actually work as part of this whole experience? So let's start off with that joining experience. So if we put all those controls in place, what will happen is an authorized user adds a guest to a team that's allowed to have guest access. That Azure B2b account is created. The guest then redeems their invitation, authenticates with their existing identity provider credentials. They're then asked to register for multi-factor authentication. That B2b account is then updated. The guest accepts or reads and accepts that terms of use, and then they can then access the team. So that's the actual joining process with all of the recommendations in place. So the next process that we look at is we've now got a guest in the team. So what will happen there? So the guest will just carry on accessing the team. They'll need to log in every day. They'll need to use their MFA every day. But what you can do is you can have set a review, and our recommendation is on a quarterly basis that we get team owners to review all of their guests in their teams. So once it's set up, you can actually create this review. As I say, it will be the team owners that will be reviewing this because they're the best placed. They own their teams. They should know who should be in the team and who shouldn't be in the team. They'll be presented with this list of guests in their team. And as I mentioned before, they've got these options to either deny or approve or take recommendations on those guest users. And based on that, at the end of the review, the guests will automatically be removed from the team that are no longer required. So say that would be done on a quarterly basis. And once it's set up, you don't need to do kind of any other kind of IT work. It's set in stone. It's any new team that's added in would be added into this review process. So how this will actually work, so this is another feature in Azure Active Directory, and it's a new piece of functionality coming in. So when you create an access review, you need to make sure when you have step 2, which teams and groups do you want to be part of this? You need to select the box, all Microsoft 365 groups with guest users. By doing that, what will happen is every time a new team is created, it'll automatically get picked up in this. And it's just for guest users. So then we need to make sure we want the group owners to do the review. So the team owners are the best place to do it. We don't want somebody in IT to try and work out which guests in which teams need access, because that's just not pragmatic. Somebody in IT is not going to know how people are interacting with external people. So it really does need to be down to those group owners. Then, as we recommend, we set it for a quarterly basis and we set an end date for never. So basically that will just keep going round once this is set up and be pushed out every quarter. Then there's a number of configuration options that you can have here. So what you can do here is, if you want, you can say, well, let's take those recommendations that if somebody has signed in for the last 30 days, we'll automatically renew them. If they haven't, we can deny them access. So you could switch things like that on if you like. You can decide to have a justification or not. You can have email notifications, a reminder, and you can add some additional text to a template as well to make it a little bit more personable and make sure people know what's going on. The important thing with this is just you've really got to make sure that as part of your training and adoption program that the team owners know they're going to get this. Otherwise, they just see this email and think, what's this? And will just ignore it. So what does the process look like? So the reviewer gets an email, and then they will be go through to a web URL, so My Access, and it will have a list of all of their users there, or the guest users within their teams, and they will get one email per team. So this is not done on if you're an owner of 20 teams, you're not going to get one access review for all of them. You will get multiple communications, and you will be kind of reviewing each. But when you click through to the URL at My Access, you will see 1 to N reviews that you need to do. So for the purposes of this, I was an owner for 2 teams, Demo 1 and Demo 2, and I've got 2 access reviews there. So I can click on one of those, open it up, and what I'll do is I'll get a list of the guests within those teams, and I can decide whether I want to approve, deny, or accept the recommendations on there. So what might happen is if you've got 2 people, somebody may have gone in and already accepted or denied that, and you would actually see the decisions there as well. So you can see if somebody's already acted on that. So that's the kind of the new one, the simple one that targets all guests on a regular basis. Now you can do guest access reviews just for selected groups as well. And one of the benefits from doing this is this has some additional steps in the end. With this option, you can actually delete the B2b account. So with that previous option, all it's going to do is remove the users from the teams. You're going to remain with this group of guest users in B2b accounts that over time is just going to grow and grow and grow. So the next option is to select the second option on that list when you're correcting an access review, and just look at selected groups. Now, when you do the selected groups, you have to go and pick which teams you want to be added. Now, the downside with this is that will work on day 1 because you can go through and add the teams in, but people are going to be adding teams in all the time. So really, it's difficult to use this unless you've got some sort of way of programmatically adding teams automatically into access reviews. So here, what the process will be and how it will be different is you do the access review. The person would say deny those guests access to the team. The guest is removed as per normal process. But then what can happen is you've got this option if you want to block the guest user from signing in for 30 days. Then after 30 days, the B2b account is deleted. This would be a soft delete state, so you could resurrect it. And then after 30 days, that would be permanently deleted. So that would be 60 days after the guest was removed from the team, their B2b account is deleted. That's a nice end-to-end process. However, from a kind of setup point of view, it's not really pragmatic to be going in here and looking at manually doing this. You would need to be doing that on a systematic basis. Then you've got another option if you want. So the third option that we can look at is having a self-review. So rather than the people within the teams reviewing the guests, you can do a review where you ask the guests, do you want to keep access to the tenant? So one of the ways that we can do this is we can set up a dynamic security group called all guests. And the rule for that would be user type equals guest. And as we saw right at the beginning, that's where the those guest users are created in Azure AD with that user type of guest. So you can create this group. Any new guest joining teams would automatically go into this group. So then when you create an access review, what you're doing is you can use that previous process that I showed, a selected group, and you select a security group, and you would select the all guest security group. Each guest would receive an email. Then what you can do is you can say, well, if the person doesn't respond, automatically remove them. So a lot of the cases, if they've left the organization, the email might bounce, etc. So you can actually just send that out. So the email to the guest, it would say, you know, you need to have access. And rather than now to a specific team, you're talking about access to the tenants. You'd need to make sure that was worded appropriately. They would go on and they would have a slightly different view. Rather than seeing a list of people that they need to review, they just got themselves to review. Do you still need access? Yes or no? And you can have that reason, that justification why you still need access. Again, this is all logged. So because you've used this process here and you've done a specific review, you can then bolt on at the end that option to be able to delete the accounts from Azure AD as well. So one of the things that you can do is, if you want, is you can have a two-pronged approach. So the recommendation is that you use that first approach where it's all guests in all teams, but it doesn't do that last step of deleting the account. It's going to make sure that you protect your data because you're going to be controlling that, but you're going to get this glut of B2B accounts. So what you can do here is you can just create it, new security group, and I've just called it inactive guest accounts. What you can do is, as part of that access review, you can upload all of the users into that group, or you can have some sort of report that says, give me a list of everyone that hasn't signed in for X amount of days, for example, and put them in a group. And then you can do a self-access review on that. And then if they don't respond or they don't want access anymore, you can actually automate that deletion of the B2B accounts. So what I've done here is I've just put a little summary of those different options there of how we can use different ways of really those guest access reviews, really to kind of streamline and automate processes, which you can kind of satisfy the needs of kind of auditors about how do you control access, how do you make sure people don't have access for any longer than they need. So just the kind of the last little bit to this, just a bit more really on that deleting of the B2B accounts. So we can do it for certain circumstances with the access review, but no, you can't do it for that all guest access review. You can't do it on there. You can bulk delete users, and you can also self-leave the organization. A guest can choose to leave. So just have a quick look at those as well. So if you bulk delete users, what you would do is you would complete your access review for all guests in all teams. And because you've got that audit at the end, you've got that option to download that into a file. You can then filter those by the denied users. And you could go in and use the bulk delete functionality upload the list of the user details and go through a process and delete the users in B2B. So that would have to be a manual step, or you could programmatically do that after the access review. So that's another option. And also there's a different option that we can look at here. Sorry, bulk delete. Skipped a slide, sorry. So yeah, you would download the report from the access review, add the denied guests UPN to the CSV file. There's a template. That's all they need is the UPN for email address. You upload it, and then you would sort of download that report. So that's kind of the upload process, and then the confirmation that it's been uploaded and it's succeeded. And you can also extract out a file there just in case there were any issues. And then you can also self-leave as well. So you can go on to your account and you can click on organizations when you're in your Microsoft 365, and you can choose to actually leave the organization as well. You've got that option if you want to leave. So just to recap, so we've gone through a number of best practices that I recommend when I'm dealing with clients on their deployment for Teams. These are the 11 steps that you should really put in place before you open those doors for guest collaboration. And what that does is that allows you then this full lifestyle process in place. You've got those controls in place to make sure that people are authenticating, they've got the right levels of access, they've signed up for your terms of use, and then they're only getting access to the teams you want them to get access. You're going to force them to sign in on a daily basis with MFA. You're going to get the team owners to review their access on a quarterly basis. So they're not going to retain access for data for too long. You can then put a process in place that you can delete those B2b accounts as well on a quarterly basis so they don't build up. And then on a yearly basis, you can reinforce that terms of use as well. So that process, once it's in place, can sort of just keep going behind the scenes, and it has kind of a minimal amount of IT involvement. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to me. So do I have any questions at all? So if you've got any questions, please feel free to put your hands up, and then I can unmute you. Okay. So if, yes. I'm just going to allow you to unmute. So yes, if you'd like to ask your question. So
yes, sorry, I didn't realize I had to unmute as well.
No.
Just wondering how the minimum active user is calculated in the new guest licensing model that you mentioned at the beginning.
Okay, so that is guests that are active within the team. So that's somebody that's kind of logged on to your domain within the last 30 days, or they've interacted in a team, so they've responded to a chat, looked at a file, etc. So they've actually done some form of interaction within your tenant, because it's really important that you don't just look at those B2B users in Azure AD, because if you don't put those measures that I've put in place or recommended, you're going to end up over time getting a huge amount of B2B users that are inactive. So that's how they calculate it.
And is it based on each activity that they conduct? So every time they log in, does it count them again and again? Or is it just, the once during the 30 days?
Yeah, it's unique users. So if somebody is very active and they've done 100 activities within the month, that is one user. So we're looking at those individual users. So Microsoft recommend that this is a better model to move to, because you're unlikely, unless you're a very, very large organization, to hit those limits and need to pay for kind of any additional licenses. And then the good thing for that is things like access review, which is an added on license. You need that as your ADP2. You no longer need that 1 to 5 licenses. You would need 1 license for the admin to actually configure that. But as long as you're under those 50,000 users, you don't need to pay any additional fees.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions at all? Just check the chat just in case there's anything in there. Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, I'm moderating for the rest of the day, so if you do think of anything, please, you can always come back later on and drop me a message, etc. Please, can I ask you to provide feedback as well? Say we've got 2, one for the event and one for the speaker. So if you've got a camera on your mobile phone, just take your camera and as if you're taking a picture of it, and it will automatically recognize that it's a QR code.
Hey,
And
Nikki?
fine. Yes.
Hey, this is Joe. Sorry, just to bump in there. I think there might be a question that someone was trying to ask in the chat a little bit further up.
Oh, sorry.
How is it possible to set a time frame, for example, 6 months, that a guest user is able to access the team? If the project has a delay, do you increase the time frame?
Yeah, so if you're doing those access reviews, so how that would work is that it would happen on a rolling basis, that every 3 months the team owner would need to go in and say this person can keep access. So if you think that your kind of project might be delayed, there might be an access review. You just go in and say, yes, I want all my guests to remain in that team. So you're not saying directly after 6 months they're automatically going to drop off. What you're saying is after 6 months or after 3 months, as that access review, it's that team owner, they are going to go in there and say, do I still need those guests in my team? So you're kind of putting that responsibility down to the team owners that should know who needs to do what. I hope that answers the question. Okay, so one last request really from everyone. What we're trying to do today is, as each session is to create a selfie. So what I'd like you to do is, if I could just ask you all just to put yourself on camera. And what we'll do is I will share my screen and we'll take a selfie picture of everybody. So hopefully any more for wanting to come into our group selfie. So if you're all ready, after 3, smile and I'll take a photo. Okay, 1, 2, 3, cheers. Brilliant. Thank you ever so much for your time today. And I hope to see you later on at some other sessions in the process today. So thank you very much. The next session will start at the top of the hour. So you've got 12 minutes before we're restarting. Thank you ever so much.